Hi, all. This is Candice with Slusher Consulting, home care consulting specifically. And today I want to talk about the Texas PAS or Personal Assistant Services category license requirements for training of your attendants. The TAC or the Texas Administrative Code calls them attendants. I tend to call them caregivers. Sometimes they're called providers, whatever you call them. There are specific things in Texas that are required to cover in training at the beginning when you orient them, and then annually. And I want to talk about those things because there's a lot of confusion out there. Depending on where you got your policy might say that your annual training has to be 12 hours a year of annual training hours for your caregivers. But that, in fact, is a home health rule for home health aides. In PAS, you don't have home health aides, you have attendants. And so the requirements are completely different. And I want to make sure that that is all cleared up, hopefully today with this video. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to me from my website at slusherconsulting.com. But let's just hit this real quick. So, when you do orientation, of course, you have to do all your backgrounds and everything, but what needs to be included in your policies and procedures, and you can cover as much as you want, but the absolute minimum is that you have to cover client rights. And in Texas, that is both the client Bill of Rights as well as the rights of the elderly. If your clients are generally over 65, you want to make sure that you hit the highlights of all of those things. And the client rights include things like how to file a complaint with the agency as well as the state, but also the fact that the clients have the right to choose who cares for them, what happens to them, what kind of care is provided. They have the right to refuse things. That needs to be covered pretty extensively within your orientation. You also want to make sure that you're covering things like abuse, neglect, and exploitation, what abuse looks like, all the different types of abuse and neglect and exploitation that there are, both to make sure that your caregivers recognize or your attendants recognize when they see those things happening in the client's home, but also so that they know which lines and boundaries not to cross for themselves. That needs to be covered. You need to review your drug testing policy, no matter what the drug testing policy is that we test upon hire and upon suspicion, or only at random, or only upon suspicion. That's fine. Or we do not drug test at all. That is also fine. But the policy needs to be reviewed in your orientation for every employee. It needs to be discussed at some point. And then emergency preparedness policies and procedures, what you are expecting of your employees during an emergency. Bottom line is, as a PAS, especially, you are not required to evacuate your clients. So you don't need to tell them things like how to get them to a shelter and stuff like that. But they do need to understand that we would rather you do not abandon your clients and leave them without notifying someone that they are being left alone, especially in a case of an emergency, that you notify us if you are aware of an emergency that we have not notified you already. Just what you expect from them when this happens. And so that they, at minimum, need to notify you as an agency so that you can notify the families that there's not going to be anybody with them today. And hopefully, you've already talked about emergency planning with your clients, so the family or the client has a backup plan, ideally. Um, you need to cover infection control, which includes universal precautions like hand washing, donning and doffing, which means putting on and taking off PPE, things like gloves, masks, other things. And then also your bloodborne pathogens training. And bloodborne pathogens, according to the OSHA standards, specifically definitely covers HIV and hepatitis B, how to clean up a blood spill or bodily fluids and handle hazardous waste. That doesn't come up a whole lot in non-medical home care, but it could happen, and your staff need to be trained on that. They need to maybe take some sort of test or whatever. You need proof of that training. And if there is a test, they need to make 100%. Now, that doesn't mean they have to just take it over and over again. You can do it like an open book kind of thing. You could all go through the test together, or at the end, you could say, okay, number one is answer B. If you didn't get B, this is why that's the answer, and make sure everybody gets it right. Doesn't matter, but the end result needs to be that they have to have a clear understanding of that. And then you do need to train on HIPAA, and in Texas specifically, HB 300, which needs to be done at hire, and HIPAA meaning the Health Information Portable Accountability Act, I think. I never get that right. But both HIPAA and HB 300, because HB 300 is specific to Texas, that needs to be trained on. And then you need to do a TB screening form, but you do not necessarily need to do a TB test unless their screening says that they are positive for some sort of symptoms. Okay. Let's see if I'm missing anything else. They need to do a hepatitis B accept or decline form. If they accept it, there does need to be follow-up in their file. If they decline, that's fine. And then we need to talk about their skills. Now, the state says that you need to verify their skills by at least one of three ways. The first one is education, and you are required to run during your employability check before hire through the nurse aid registry. And that then will tell you if they've ever been to nurse aid school, even if they're not currently a CNA, or if it expired a long time ago, or if they've not been really working as a CNA. If they went through school and had their CNA at some point, then that you can verify that they had that education. And then you would just need to verify that, that they know how to use those skills. The other is through reference checks. So you need to ensure that they have been doing this type of job in another environment, and then that does help you prove that they have the skills needed. And then the third option is training. So the state's been kind of looking at this a little more closely. They used to really just accept some sort of self-assessment, a skills checklist, just to verify I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. But the truth is, if they've done that and it's been a while, you're not there to manage them. You're not there to oversee them. They go out into the client's homes. That's where they provide the care. You cannot be there to oversee and make sure they know what they're doing. So the state wants to make sure that you have a verification in some way of this skills or training. Now, the easiest way to do that, well, I don't know that it's always easier, could be to just train them individually with their client, but you also don't want to give the client the impression that they don't know how to do it. So during their first shift with your agency, you may want to just spend a little time with that client. Make sure that when you introduce a client to the caregiver, that the caregiver feels comfortable. If there's a transfer with the showers, things like that. Now, that doesn't mean you have to go and watch the caregiver give a shower. Some agencies will do training videos and do a little test to verify that they have a mental understanding and that they can explain the process of giving someone a shower, of washing hands, of toileting, of bedbound care, of transferring, things like that. That's okay. You don't have to have a lab set up in your agency. I mean, it's not a terrible idea. I like to keep a gate belt and just at very minimum make sure during orientation that someone can transfer me from one chair to another so that they know what they're doing. That's a good teaching opportunity. Now, if you yourself or the person who is doing the hiring or orientation within your organization doesn't understand those things, I probably would recommend going ahead and getting them some training too, so that they can guide. Really, anyone that your staff talks to within your agency needs to be able to give some sort of verbal or guidance or physically show or demonstrate how to do the tasks that your clients need. Now, homemaking and things like that, nobody's too worried about. Obviously, if they can't cook, hopefully they'll tell you they can't cook, so you don't send them out there to a client who's expecting a three-course meal. But um, otherwise, when it comes to personal care, you do need to have some sort of verification that they know how to do what needs to be done for the client. And there's not really a right or wrong way to do that, but you do have to have some sort of verification. The state's looking for that now. Okay. Now, annually, then, the actual only requirements for annual is obviously to do the employee annual evaluation for performance. You have to rerun their employability checks, which is the employee misconduct registry and the nurse aid registry. And then you need to review annually the emergency preparedness policies and employee responsibilities. Now, what I have always done and what works for me is that every year when you do your annual emergency preparedness plan review, which includes either activating the plan and reviewing it afterwards or performing a drill and reviewing it afterwards, if you do a live drill that includes every single employee, whether they have a shift or not, whether they have a client assignment or not, if you include every active employee during those drills or during the plan, then and document it as such, that is covers you for the annual emergency preparedness training. I think that's a better idea because at orientation, you just talk about in theory what could happen and what we would expect from you. But if you put them through the training that you yourself have to go through anyway, now they also have some real time training. And real time, is that the right word? Real life, real training. And that does count as your annual training for emergency preparedness. Then they need to redo or take a different bloodborne pathogens, universal precautions type of training. You can just run them through the exact same test they did at orientation, and that's acceptable. It's a review. Or if you find a different type of video or some other sort of training and you want to change it up a little bit, that's not a bad idea either. You also need to annually redo the HIPAA or and HB 300 training, and you need to redo the TB screening test every year just to make sure that they still are negative for symptoms, ideally. And of course, if they're positive, they could get, I think it's a blood test now. I don't think they still do the skin test, or even a chest X-ray would be fine. And then lastly, the annual training needs to be on any additional policies that the agency has that affects the caregivers or the staff in some way. Now, ideally, in my mind, if you implemented a policy 6 months ago that would affect them, at the time that you implemented it, you would have shared all of that with everyone and make sure that they have an understanding of it, and that would be documented. But if it's not something that is major or that really affected their work and you just want to review, these are some new policies, that's fine. You can do that during the annual evaluation. That is all I have to say about that. Training is not that hard. I mean, not that it's easy, but in PAS, they don't request or require that you have unlicensed personnel come in for 12 hours of training. It's just not necessary, and it's very hard to do. So if your policy says that you will do 12 hours of training per year for all of your staff, edit your policy because it's not required unless you have a licensed home health and all of your aides or caregivers or attendants are also considered home health aides. But if you don't employ home health aides and you employ instead PAS attendants, this is it. Okay. So don't beat yourself up over it, but get it done and do it right. In particular, the state is really watching to make sure you have some sort of verification of those skills at the beginning. I hope that this has been helpful, and reach out to me if you need anything. Thanks a lot.